Excellencies, distinguished delegates, distinguished experts, dear colleagues, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this high-level event on addressing and responding to racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. The event is jointly organized by UNODC and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The objective of today's event is for member states and other stakeholders to, number one, learn more about the work of the United Nations in addressing and responding to racial discrimination in the criminal justice system in line with international obligations and commitments, and with regard to recent developments, including the High Commissioner for Human Rights 4-point agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality for Africans and people of African descent. And the second part is to exchange information on actions, programs, and recommendations to address racial discrimination in criminal justice systems, in particular with regard to Africans and people of African descent. We will open the session with addresses by Ms. Gadawali, the Executive Director of UNODC, and a video message from Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We'll then hear from Justice Ron Mokoro from the International Independent Expert Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in Law Enforcement, who will introduce some information about the mandate of the mechanism. And after that, we'll hear from Ms. Ojiku Nwabozo of the European Network Against Racism, who will provide a regional and civil society perspective on racial discrimination within criminal justice systems. And finally, after the presentations, we will have an exchange and dialogue session with member states and others who are participating. And then finally, last but not least, we'll have a wrap up we're pleased here to have Ms. Nada El Nashif, who is the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, who will wrap up the session at the end. So now I will start by inviting the Executive Director of UNODC, Ms. Gadawali, to take the floor. Ms. Wali.
Thank you. Thank you, John, and thank you, colleagues who are joining us. سعادة سفير تونس، أهلا وسهلا. أهلا بيك. Very happy to welcome all of you, excellencies, dear colleagues. Building a world beyond racism and discrimination, where we can all exercise our human rights without fear or favor, depends on crime prevention and criminal justice institutions that work for everyone. I think this could not be timelier with everything that we're following, and the devastating incidents that are happening in the US in the last few days was very, very devastating to see still criminal activities based on racial discrimination taking place. I therefore welcome this timely event at the 31st Crime Commission to discuss how we can better address and respond to racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. I would like to begin by thanking our distinguished panelists, as well as our partners at OHCHR for holding this event with UNODC. Ensuring non-discrimination and equal access to justice for all is an integral component of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, in particular SDG Target 16.3. The UN has further highlighted the importance of promoting and protecting the human rights of people of African descent, building on the Durban Declaration and Program of Action during the International Decade for People of African Descent launched in 2015. The Kyoto Declaration, adopted the 14th Congress, Crime Congress, emphasizes the role that crime prevention and criminal justice institutions play in preventing discrimination, supporting victims' access to justice, and ending impunity. In promoting the rule of law, the declaration highlights the needs to ensure equal access to justice and application of the law to all, including vulnerable members of society, regardless of their status, including by taking appropriate measures to ensure treatment with respect and without discrimination or bias of any kind. A comprehensive criminal justice approach to addressing racial discrimination must encompass a range of interventions, from promoting access to justice for victims and witnesses of crime motivated by discrimination and hate, to promoting inclusion and representation in criminal justice institutions and professions. To help implement such inclusive, integrated responses, UNODC is committed to supporting law enforcement and criminal justice institutions that reflect the diversity of the communities they serve. Our office offers extensive experience in building capacities and providing training for criminal justice practitioners, as well as in reviewing and enhancing legal frameworks to ensure equal access to justice and increasing access to legal aid. Furthermore, UNODC is proud to act as the criminal justice pillars lead to the UN Network on Racial Discrimination and Protection of Minorities. We are also undertaking activities in the field to promote non-discrimination and access to justice. For example, the latest update of the Latin America and the Caribbean Crime Victimization Survey Initiative, led by the UNODC INEGI Center of Excellence, addressed experiences of discrimination with respect to crime reporting and satisfaction with the police. In Mexico, UNODC has worked with local partners on an awareness-raising campaign against racism and xenophobia. We also launched a Blue Heart campaign to target the high prevalence of human trafficking in indigenous communities. In Brazil, the office is developing a guide to promote racial equality with respect to electronic monitoring services, alternatives to imprisonment, and the provision of psychosocial assistance to people in custody. Finally, our office in Colombia has started a project to measure diversity and inclusion in police forces in Latin America, looking at indigenous populations, people of African descent, and migrants. UNODC stands ready to expand activities to other regions and support member states in collecting disaggregated data to support tailored responses against discrimination. This side event is an opportunity to explore concrete ideas with OHCHR and other partners for stepping up our cooperation and work in the areas of equal access to justice for all and preventing and combating hate crime through policy, tool development, and joint programming with a participatory and representative approach. I thank you once again for joining us today, and I wish you productive discussions. Thank you. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Ms. Wally. We'll now listen to a video message from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Michelle Bachelet.
Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's event. Fair trial, equal access to justice, due process. These are just some of the fundamental human rights central to today's discussion. They are rights which should be enjoyed by all without discrimination. Yet around the world, these rights are in peril, threatened by criminal justice systems which discriminate, harass, and intimidate. The United Nations Human Rights Mechanism have long documented concerns about policies and practices in law enforcement and the criminal justice system which affect various groups disproportionately, in particular racial and ethnic minorities. The evidence is clear. Racial profiling, harassment, verbal abuse, and abuse of power by law enforcement officials are widespread in many countries. So too are discriminatory stop and search measures, ill treatment, arbitrary arrest, and excessive use of force, at times leading to death. And all too often, these human rights violations are accompanied by broad impunity and little to no accountability. I welcome the 2015 Doha Declaration's reaffirmation of the commitment and strong political will of states to effective, fair, humane, and accountable criminal justice systems. The recognition of the responsibility of states to uphold human rights, including for vulnerable members of society who may be subject to multiple and aggravated forms of discrimination, is an important step forward. The Doha Declaration further commits states to intensify national and international efforts to eliminate all forms of discrimination, including racism. The Kyoto Declaration in 2021 reaffirmed the commitment to, and I will quote, ensure equal access to justice and application of the law to all, regardless of their status, including by taking appropriate measures to ensure treatment with respect and without discrimination or bias of any kind by criminal justice institutions, end of quote. States have a responsibility to uphold these commitments. Some states have undertaken welcome steps to address racism and racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, but further comprehensive efforts are needed to achieve racial justice and equality for all. Excellencies, as we know, the brutal murder of George Floyd in 2020 prompted global outrage. sparking a wave of protests and increasing attention to the issue of systemic racism against people of African descent, both within and outside the criminal justice system. In June last year, I presented a report to the Human Rights Council focusing on systemic racism and international human rights law violation by law enforcement agencies against Africans and people of African descent. Beyond criminal justice, the report also highlighted a litany of violations of economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights suffered by people of African descent on a daily basis around the world, rooted in histories of and legacies of enslavement, the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans, and colonialism. My agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality, outlined in the report, set out 20 actionable recommendations that provide a roadmap for making real progress. It is rooted in the obligations of states under international human rights treaties and their political commitments. It is also rooted in the life experiences of people of African descent. Behind the data and the reports are the faces and daily lives of people and families. People and families suffer discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion in many states. Their experiences are shaped by historical legacies compounded by cycles of structural inequalities that have lasted generations. Nowhere is this discrimination more visible than in law enforcement and the criminal justice system. We see an alarming picture of system-wide disproportionate impacts on people of African descent in some countries. We see excessive number of African and people of African descent in prison populations. We see Blackness being associated with criminality and delinquency. This is both dehumanizing and deeply destructive. And this blatant discrimination is only compounded by other factors such as socioeconomic, work or migration status, sex, gender, sexual orientation and gender identity, religion and psychosocial disabilities. Lack of accountability for law enforcement officers is also an enormous obstacle. Investigations are deficient. Oversight, complaint, and accountability mechanisms lack independence. There is widespread presumption of guilt against people of African descent. With rare exceptions, investigations, prosecutions, trials, and judicial decisions fail to consider the role that racial discrimination, stereotypes, and institutional bias may have played. Additionally, families of those who died after an encounter with law enforcement officials have expressed a profound lack of trust in the criminal justice system, highlighting the lack of support they face during accountability processes. Excellencies, we cannot sit by and continue to watch history repeat itself. I urge states to reimagine and reform their policing and criminal justice systems, placing human rights at the center of this effort. People of African descent and other communities must be included in these discussions. New models of justice need to protect and serve everybody without discrimination. Such new models must play a crucial role in ending impunity, strengthening public trust, and fostering strong relationships between law enforcement and all the communities they serve. They should tackle the discriminatory application of criminal law. I call on states to reform their drug-related policies, laws, and practices in line with international human rights standards. I also urge states to implement reforms to restrict use of force and prohibit racial profiling. Law enforcement officials who commit violations against Africans and people of African descent and other racial and ethnic groups must be brought to justice, and victims and their families must be provided redress. Excellencies, racial discrimination in law enforcement and the criminal justice system cannot be separated from systemic racism. Only by addressing both and the legacies they're built on can we succeed in eliminating it. The UN human rights system, including the new international independent expert mechanism, will continue its commitment to support states and others to achieve racial justice in the criminal justice system. This is a priority and responsibility for all of us here today. Let's all commit to ensuring it happens. Thank you.
Thank you. And through Nada Al-Nashif, the UN Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, who's with us today, through her, I'll thank Ms. Bachelet for her interesting remarks. And now I have the pleasure of inviting Justice Yvonne Makoro to take the floor. Justice Makoro is former Justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, former acting justice at the Lesotho Appeals Court and the Namibia Supreme Court, and former chairperson of the South African Law Reform Commission and president of Africa Legal Aid. She's currently the chair of the International Independent Expert Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in Law Enforcement, which was established by the Human Rights Council in 2021. Justice Makoro, you have the floor.
Thank you, John. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it is truly my great pleasure to participate in this event on addressing racial discrimination in the criminal justice system on the margins of the 31st session of the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. This is a topic which is closely linked to the mandate of the new International Independent Expert Mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement, which I am honored to represent here today as its chairperson. The expert mechanism, which also comprises of Dr. Tracy Kazee and Professor Juan Mendez, was established in July 2021 by the Human Rights Council. Resolution 47/21 recalled events and steps which led to the establishment of this mechanism. From the tragic murder of George Floyd in the United States in May 2020, to the urgent debate at the Council in June 2020 on current racially inspired human rights violations, systemic racism, police brutality, and violence against peaceful protests, to Council Resolution 43/1, and in June 2021, to the High Commissioner's report and 4-point agenda towards transformative change and racial justice and equality, A/47/47/53. Our mechanism's 3-year mandate, seeks to further transformative change for the racial justice and equality for Africans and people of African descent in the context of law enforcement globally, especially where relating to the legacies of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade in enslaved Africans. Our mechanism is also mandated to investigate the responses of governments to peaceful anti-racism protests and all violations of international human rights law, and to contribute to accountability and redress for victims. In doing so, we conduct inclusive outreach and consultations with states, directly affected individuals and communities, and other stakeholders. We also conduct country visits, taking into account an intersectional approach. We are particularly keen to engage and consult with law enforcement in all parts of the world. Our mechanism will report annually to the Human Rights Council's September session during a joint enhanced interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner, prioritizing the participation of directly affected individuals and communities, including victims of law enforcement violations and their families. Our report will thereafter be transmitted to the General Assembly. Pursuant to Resolution 47/21, the expert mechanism must examine systemic racism in law enforcement and the criminal justice system and its root causes as faced by Africans and people of African descent. The excessive use of force, racial profiling, and other human rights violations by law enforcement officials, including with regard to patterns, policies, processes, and specific incidents, Our mechanism will also examine any connection between supremacist movements and actors within law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Through our work, and in particular our engagement with law enforcement at country level, we are mandated to make recommendations. The recommendations must address systemic racism in law enforcement and the criminal justice system, closing trust deficits, strengthening institutional oversight, adopting alternative and complementary methods to policing and the use of force, and encouraging stock-taking of lessons learned. We will also make recommendations on how the use of force by enforcement officials in domestic legal regimes can be brought in line with international human rights standards, and what concrete steps are needed to ensure access to justice, accountability, and redress for excessive use of force and other human rights violations by law enforcement officials against Africans and people of African descent. We will also monitor the implementation of recommendations on ending impunity for violations by law enforcement officials emanating from the High Commissioner's report and identify obstacles to the full implementation of those recommendations. Finally, our mechanism is mandated to make recommendations on the collection and publication of data with strict safeguards and in line with international law, disaggregated by victims' race or ethnic origin, on deaths and serious injuries by law enforcement officials and related prosecutions and convictions, as well as any disciplinary action to drive and assess responses to systemic racism in the area of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Our first report to the Council will focus on the importance of disaggregated data, which United States human rights mechanisms have identified as key to highlighting and addressing institutional racism and racial disparities in the criminal justice system, to informing policy decisions grounded in evidence, and to drive impactful responses which can contribute to accountability and redress for Africans and people of African descent. We have held several consultations with experts in different regions on the issue of the collection, publication, and analysis of data on policing. We've also issued a call for submissions to all stakeholders. Across our mandate, we have highlighted the importance of sharing promising state initiatives and practices in the areas of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. We urge states to share information on action taken to address and evidence gathered regarding racial discrimination against Africans and people of African descent in the context of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Importantly, Resolution 47/21 calls on our mechanism to coordinate our work and further strengthen our participation, engagement, and cooperation with all relevant United Nations mechanisms, bodies, processes, including the UNODC and the UN Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. I'm therefore delighted to have had the opportunity to engage with Ms. Wally in this event and to begin the experts mechanisms dialogue with states and other stakeholders at the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. We look forward to our continued exchanges as we seek to advance racial justice and equality for Africans and people of African descent the world over. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Makoro, for highlighting the nuances of this issue, but also introducing the important work of the mechanism. And last but not least, for our expert panel, I'd like to ask Ms. Ojiku Nwabuzo, who is the Senior Research Officer at European Network Against Racism, a pan-European network of civil society organizations, to please take the floor. Ms. Nwabuzo?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. My intervention will speak mostly to racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, but also with the focus of people of African descent in Europe. And I will speak about systemic racism and also our focus historically on a punitive kind of response to some societal issues, and which really is one of the main factors which pervades Black people's experience with institutions in Europe across the board. For some years, my organization, ENA, has focused on working on racial profiling, looking at discrimination in law enforcement, and we see across the board that there is racial profiling that impacts on racialized groups, and it's a discrimination that violates human rights norms. We have more recently been working on the use of technologies and how the use of technologies can encourage disproportionate impact on racialized groups, especially because the use of technologies can have the impact of misidentifying Black people in particular. Research has shown this. Profiling is a problem across the board, not just for citizens in Europe, but also for migrants. And this can have a problem at the borders, at the European borders. During COVID, another organization that we have worked with in the past did a small-scale study where they were looking at how Afro-descendants were impacted by COVID and law enforcement and the new rules that were put in place during COVID times. And they highlighted many cases of people of African descent who were stopped by the police, profiled by the police, and threatened to be deported from the country at any time. Going beyond racial profiling and thinking about the criminal justice system more widely, through our research and other organizations' research, we see that racialized groups, particularly Black people, experience differential treatment on the basis of their race. And this is not just in terms of criminalization, but also regarding their treatment as victims. In a report that we produced, I think it was in 2018, we looked at the criminal justice response to victims of hate crime. And we can see there were many cases across Europe where victims were reporting their crimes to the police, to law enforcement, and the police and the courts were less likely to believe these victims and individuals with their cases of hate crimes. So there are questions regarding access to justice, dissatisfaction, lack of trust with the criminal justice system, and also more beyond that as well with regards to prosecutors, defense lawyers. More recently, I worked on a report looking at police brutality, and some of the victims of police brutality also reported that they had a lack of trust with their own defense lawyers. So we can see how there are many areas where the criminal justice system can fail people of African descent and other racialized groups. We have to think of this as not just an issue with the criminal justice system. This is why we think about the impact as we think about structural racism and systemic racism, because the combination of many factors, many different policies, many different practices can lead to racialized groups being more likely to be incarcerated. We see that very clearly with drug policy, but there are other policies that may also impact on racialized groups. And we see with the disproportionate number of incarcerated racialized groups and Black people in particular, how the systemic policies can impact on different groups. So for example, we see in several countries in Europe, Austria, France, Finland, Portugal, and the UK, there have been reports, there has been research that has documented that there are disproportionately high number of Black people in prison. Specifically, for example, in Portugal, 19% of the total prison population were foreigners, and of that group, 58% among them were Africans. So we see in many cases how the criminal justice system fails racialized groups and people of African descent. Some of the recommendations that we have compiled over the years, many of us working in this area know of the situation of racialized groups. So what are the recommendations? I would like to support many of the recommendations from the High Commissioner's report, which are really incredibly relevant to the EU. And I think what the 4 pillars help us to do is identify some of the principles that we need to have when we are thinking about changing policies and changing practices. One question that we have to have at the heart is we need to ask ourselves, how can communities feel safe and protected? For racialized groups, it's not about more securitization, it's not about more police and law enforcement. We need to think how we invest in communities. We need to have a structural and intersectional approach to addressing the problem. And this is where we can talk about transformative change and systemic changes, not just reforms. It's really incredibly crucial to have the voices of racialized groups at the heart of this discussion, whether it's at a local level or an international level. And I would like to also mention the UN Civil Society Coalition that I have been part of over the last couple of years, in where we have been following up with the Human Rights Council and specifically trying to advocate towards the resolution 43/1. And obviously resulting in the mechanism and other activities to advance racial justice and equality in law enforcement. And I think this is really an important model where we have centered directly impacted communities and individuals at the heart of these discussions. And there are many organizations doing this work. So institutions need to hear the voices and also hear about other concepts, other ways to address this problem, introducing concepts such as transformative justice, concepts such as abolition and decriminalization. These concepts come from the ground, come from the people who are the victims, and have been, these concepts have also been developed over decades, not just by civil society, but also academics as well. So there are many alternatives to kind of the situation that we have at the moment, but I would highlight that it's really important that we center creating safety among our communities. And another recommendation that I also would like to highlight is around equality data collection. I think this is really important for member states across the board, and also to implement the EU Action Plan Against Racism, which now has suggested that there will be a potential extension on an EU directive on law enforcement. So these are all the possible recommendations, and we do need a transformative change, and this needs to take place in partnership with racialized groups. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and particularly for highlighting the recommendations and giving them a kind of practical context. So that ends our panel of experts. In the next part of our session, we'll turn to interventions from participants wishing to take the floor. We have about 10 minutes for this, and then before we turn to our closing speaker, so I would ask that people keep their intervention short, if possible, to 2 minutes. Because we need to end our session by 2 p.m. Vienna time today. I will turn to first speaker who it's a pleasure to have today, who will take the floor as an intervention of a participant, His Excellency Mr. Mohamed Mazgani, the permanent representative of Tunisia to the UN organizations in Vienna, who I understand will actually be speaking on behalf of the Africa Group. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, John. Executive Director, Ms. Ghadawali, dear panelists and guests, the criminal justice system plays an integral role in maintaining law and order and ensuring fair justice in society. The objective of the criminal justice system is to keep communities safe, enforce the law, and ensure offenders are meted and sentences proportional to their crime. However, the criminal justice system is not perfect and has come under increasing scrutiny for its unequal treatment of people of African descent across the world. More often than not, statistics indicate that racial disparity permeates the criminal justice system, especially for Africans who are more likely to be arrested, convicted, and serve lengthier and harsher prison sentences. People of African descent are often faced with racial profiling and structural bias within judicial and procedural process. There is also a disproportionate trend to criminalize rather than rehabilitate people of African descent. Indigenous and Aboriginal people often face the same plight in their own countries, which is indicative of pervasive and systematic prejudices. Chairperson, Black Lives Matter campaign against the brutal killing of George Floyd's death brought to the fore continued police brutality, the injustice and relentless discrimination against people of African descent often face in their daily lives. This has resonated deeply in Africa as we are confronted with the reality that the global fight for racial equality is far from over. The deeply rooted prejudices faced by Africans within the criminal justice system can be described akin to the vestiges of colonization and imperialism. Africa is still trying to throw the shackles off. The global campaign ignited a call for racial equality across the world and draw attention to unfairness and prejudice pervading the criminal justice system. This has provoked a deeper reflection of the linkages between discrimination, racism, poverty, inequality, and incarceration that reinforce negative stereotypes and perpetuated a cycle of desolation and helplessness. Further to this, African women face both racism and gender inequality within the criminal justice system. In this regard, greater effort should be expended on addressing these underlying factors rather than the utilization of harmful, putative measures that contributes to further societal and racial stigmatization. Attention must also be drawn to the unfair treatment and dehumanization of prisoners of African descent in some countries, which robs them of their dignity and sets back their rehabilitation and integration into society. This is why the implementation of the minimum requirements of the Nelson Mandela rules has become more relevant and should be promoted more vigorously within prison settings across the world. The principal tenet of the Nelson Mandela rules is respect for a prisoner's dignity and value as a human being. It's not only affirms their human rights, but also prohibits torture and other forms of ill treatment. In closing, there should be closer coordination between the African Union Commission on Human and People's Rights and the United Nations Human Rights Council to address systematic racism, police brutality, and eradicate archaic tools of bigotry, remnant of the colonial era from the model criminal justice system as discussed during the 2018 HRC debate in Geneva. It is only by acknowledging that the problem exists can we seek meaningful solutions to address racial discrimination within criminal justice system so it can fulfill its true purpose of maintaining law and order. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I see that Canada is asking for the floor, so I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Dorette Pollard from the Canadian Ministry of Justice. Ms. Pollard, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gardawali, ladies and gentlemen, our excellencies, I am pleased to join you from my home office in Ottawa, the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg Nation. Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to talk about Canada's Black Justice Strategy. Anti-Black racism, as we've heard earlier, and systemic discrimination also in Canada remains entrenched in our criminal justice system and other institutions. Last December, Prime Minister Trudeau mandated the Minister of Justice to develop Canada's Black Justice Strategy with support of Canada's Anti-Racism Secretariat and in cooperation with the provinces and territories, as well as experts from the Black community. The goal is to address systemic anti-Black racism, discrimination, and the overrepresentation of individuals from Black communities in the criminal justice system. Ultimately, this mandate seeks to ensure all Canadians have access to fair and just treatment. There have been many key reports and recommendations over the years. In this regard, especially including the 2017 report of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent on its mission to Canada to the United Nations Human Rights Council. These will be invaluable as we develop Canada's Black Justice Strategy. To be truly meaningful and transformative, this strategy will be informed by inclusive consultations reflecting the diversity of backgrounds, experiences, and expertise of Black people in Canada, as well as key considerations such as language, gender, age, ethnocultural background, religion, immigration status, as well as sexual orientation, and indeed disability. Finally, Canada's Black Justice Strategy is but one of a suite of current initiatives by the Government of Canada, which include proposing criminal law reform, increasing diversity in the judiciary, and implementing impact, race, and cultural assessments in all provinces and territories. These are all topics Canada would be pleased to discuss in a future gathering of this body. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. I now would like to give the floor to Mr. Chris Smith, who's the acting Deputy Director in the Office of International Affairs of the United States Department of Justice. Mr. Smith?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and thank you to UNODC and the Office of the High Commissioner for organizing this informative discussion on this extremely important topic. Especially in light of recent events, the United States reiterates its commitment to the fair and impartial administration of justice. We encourage engagement to improve our understanding of the interests, needs, and perspectives of marginalized and underserved communities, and to strengthen and increase public confidence and trust in law enforcement. It is also vital that we have representation from diverse communities amongst those working as law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges. This engagement and participation ensures that law enforcement addresses the needs of the communities that it is sworn to serve. It increases the reporting of crimes and hate incidents, improves witness cooperation and participation in the justice process, and ensures appropriate consideration of the needs of victims. In the United States, the U.S. Attorney General has also recently announced specific reforms to law enforcement practices, including by advancing the use of body-worn cameras as a tool to increase transparency and accountability. This is just one example of a concrete step that we have taken in this important area. However, our work to ensure the fair and impartial administration of justice continues, and it is vital. And to that end, we would like to thank UNODC and the panelists today for their valuable contributions on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to have two more speakers. We'll have to limit it to two more, so we'll be on time. So my next speaker, I'd like to give the floor, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Professor Joshua Castellino, who's the Executive Director of the Minority Rights Group International. Professor Castellino.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to address you today, and I want to endorse every word of what my sisters, Justice Mokboro and Ms. Nwabuzo have said, and also to commend ODC and OHCHR for the quality of its engagement in holding a difficult line in terms of criminal justice systems. Your Excellencies, there's no finer way to put it than this. We are in a critical time for humanity, and scapegoat politics has become the norm. The scapegoat politics is being used by populists, mostly men, to try and create artificial majorities by targeting a group. The group that's being targeted in every instance are ethnic, racial, linguistic, religious minorities, people with disabilities, indigenous peoples, women at the forefront of this facing intersectional discrimination. It's inevitable then that the pressure that's coming on these communities is immense. But let me not just present you with the problem. I can testify to the work in which MRG, Minority Rights Group, is present in about 60 countries, that there is an incredible energy and force counteracting this. And these people are standing up and stepping out and going beyond the call of duty to be able to challenge this. I call on you to work with these communities, work as closely as you can with these communities. And I want to draw attention to the comprehensive recommendations of the 8th Forum of the United Nations Forum on Minority Rights that was formed in 2015. I thank you for your work and look forward to engaging with you in a cooperative spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Now, lastly, but not least, it's a pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Gamal G, as he's known, Turawa, who's the Diversity Inclusion Facilitator and a former police officer. Mr. Turawa, do you have the floor?
Thank you. Thank you to the UNODC for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to speak in front of such a group of such eminent personalities. As has been told, I'm a Black guy, I'm a gay guy, I'm a former police officer, and I've recently just made a film about my experiences called The Black Cop, which is out, won a BAFTA this year. I'm almost 60, and I have been to so many events, organized events and stuff over the years, where we get stuck in this area of just looking constantly at data. And it's almost like we're constantly trying to prove that there is a problem. And I think we need to get to a place where we actually start to take real action and stop coming and stop collecting it. The data is without question. It's about the action now. It's about what do we do to make sure that the people on the street feel safe. We get stuck in a place of looking at explicit knowledge rather than the tacit knowledge. You know, we need, and I think Ms. Forgive me if I pronounced the name wrong, in Nwabuzo said, we need more of the lived experience. And I think that we need more of the lived experience in spaces like this. We need to hear more from people who are actually living in those worlds rather than being spoken about or spoken for. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Turawa. And I see that Anna put on the chat box the link to your documentary. So I'll certainly take a look. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it. And now we've actually hit the limit of our time, so I'm going to turn over to Ms. Nada El Nashif, the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, who will provide closing remarks for the event.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John, and thank you to all the participants, the panelists. Let me try some final reflections and a little bit of a reminder, I think, of a few points. We are all agreeing the criminal justice system plays a critical role in ending impunity. as a pathway to deterrence and to strengthening public trust and to fostering strong relationships between law enforcement and those communities that they serve. Crucially, we also know that racial discrimination in law enforcement and the criminal justice system cannot be separated from questions of systemic racism. This racism is often rooted in legacies of the past, and it's shaped by discrimination on the grounds established by the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. There is often a compounded impact. The ambassador of Tunisia spoke to this. Women of African descent, for example, are a very stark reminder of what happens on the ground if you are at that crossroads. And I think Mr. Jamal just spoke to that as well, perhaps. Only approaches that tackle both crimes of the past, violations, and the shortcomings of the present will help to address systemic racism effectively and can therefore perhaps succeed in eliminating it. The High Commissioner has made key recommendations on how to address racial discrimination against Africans and people of African descent over the years. In July of last year, we suggested a concrete plan on how to end impunities for human rights violations by law enforcement officials in her agenda towards transformative change. That agenda, of course, is in the public domain, but let me just say that it calls for states to undertake profound introspection. It encourages the participation of people of African descent and affected communities to reimagine policing and reform the criminal justice system from a human rights perspective. The agenda calls for potential discriminatory application of criminal law to be tackled at every stage, including by reforming, for example, drug-related policies, laws, and practices with discriminatory outcomes, very much keeping the international human rights standards at the heart of this equation. So it's clear that we need reforms and new models of justice in order to ensure that these recommendations can indeed be translated into action plans, concrete measures, specific time-bound commitments developed through national dialogues with the affected communities central to these discussions. Ms. Nwabuzo spoke to the trust deficits that exist, and we just heard again the reminder of the need to invest at the community level, particularly anchoring in the voices of grassroots organizations. The UN anti-racism architecture has been strengthened in recent years, building on crucial work and recommendations made over the decades by existing mechanisms. And you heard from the chair of the new expert mechanism of the Council for Human Rights, Justice Mogoro, exactly what they have in mind and what this expert mechanism will bring in the focus on the issue of these discriminations. We're also pleased that the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent is starting its work as a consultative mechanism for people of African descent and other stakeholders with a broad and solid mandate for improving the safety and the quality of life and livelihoods for people of African descent. The Office of the High Commissioner obviously stands ready to continue to provide support to and to strengthen our assistance. We will report to the Council on an annual basis on systemic racism and violations of international human rights law against people of African descent, as part also of the implementation of the International Decade on People of African Descent. So these are, again, the mechanisms. There's a program of activities that was given to us. And as Ms. Wali, the Executive Director, and the High Commissioner both reiterated about the support that the UN is providing to the member states and broader stakeholders, we will continue to work together, including through the UN network on racial discrimination and the protection of minorities. The Crime Commission and the Human Rights Council both have critical roles to play to address and prevent racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. And I think we encourage the Crime Commission to continue to consider these important issues, strengthening the cooperation with our office, the UN human rights mechanisms, and we also welcome the greater engagement at regional level too, including the African Union. And I must say that it will take all of us working together to make sure that these joint efforts can really make a difference, impact on the ground, and ensuring equality and just societies for all. Thank you very much, John. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nada, for really a wonderful summary, and there's really not a lot left to be said. I do want to take the opportunity to thank OHCHR. We really value our partnership and our work together, and we learn from you, and it enhances our work. And I think, of course, is what we want to do. We want to get everybody from the UN together working on these issues. And we did in the chat box, you'll see links to some sites where you'll see more information on our work together and also on UNODC's work, as well as the link to G's documentary. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today for a wonderful session, for the distinguished speakers, and I wish you all a good night, good day, or good morning, wherever you are. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.